All right, everybody, welcome back to the #1 television program in the history of the entire universe. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon, The Blackest Heart, and The Lonesome Crown. All three books published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. Now, today I'm going to be reviewing Conan The Wanderer, and this is book number 4 in the Conan series that came out in the 1970s, I think. A 10-book series of Conan novels, Conan stories, all the Conan things compiled together. So far, I've reviewed book number 1, which is just entitled Conan, and book number 2, Conan of Samaria, and then book number 3, Conan the Freebooter. I've reviewed those 3. We will be reviewing all 10 of them eventually. But now we are to book number 4, Conan the Wanderer. It's 4 stories in this book. Usually these Conan books are compiled of the, all the Conan. Robert E. Howard wrote, the Conan books. But he wrote, most of them was just short stories, and they're kind of all compiled into different versions and different omnibuses. But these are the versions I collected when I was young, because they were popular and they were for sale in the bookstore. And Conan did not write, Robert E. Howard did not write all of the stories within these compilations. A few of them were written by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, and those were stories to sort of fill in the gaps in the timeline between some of the Robert E. Howard stories. And I like them. I think that they really copy Robert E. Howard's writing style and prose pretty accurately. And their stories are every bit as adventurous and fun to read as the original Robert E. Howard books. Let's talk about the cover first, because I love graphic design and cover illustration, and this has got a great cover. A lot of these books have covers by Frank Frazetta. Some of them have covers by Boris Vallejo, and Boris Vallejo is dope. He's a good cover artist. I like all of his stuff. Keep in mind, these Robert E. Howard stories were written back in the 1930s. I mean, that was pre-Lord of the Rings. That was pre-Tolkien. And as I was reading through these stories, I was like, I wonder if Tolkien ever read Robert E. Howard. Someone tell me if they've heard if that has happened. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure I could just do a quick Google search, and I probably should have done a quick Google search before I did this video to answer my own question. But maybe it'll be more fun if you guys do it and then leave it in the comments. Was J.R.R. Tolkien aware of Robert E. Howard and the Conan universe? Because the Conan universe, though it's not as expansive and filled with folklore and magic and mystery as Middle-earth, it is a really expansive universe that Robert E. Howard has created. Anyway, and there's even a map, just like Tolkien did. Robert E. Howard even did a map. Anyway, okay, so we all know who Conan the Barbarian is. He's this guy right here. And he goes on adventures. He's an orphan boy, starts out as an orphan boy, parents killed, goes into slavery, breaks out of slavery, goes on adventures. And now we're to Conan the Wanderer. And it's titled Conan the Wanderer for a reason. These are 4 stories where Conan is sort of wandering aimlessly and alone through the landscape. He's 31 years old. The first story in the book is called Black Tears. And it is not written by Robert E. Howard. It is written by the L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter writing team. And it's a pretty cool story of Conan at 31. He's at the height of his physical prowess. He's in his prime. He leads a band of raiders and plunderers. They plunder cities and caravans, and he spends 2 years sort of wandering through the deserts of Turania. There's the Shemites. He becomes a chieftain, and then he's sort of betrayed by men who are jealous of him. And then we get into the next story, Shadows in Zambula, which is a story written exclusively by Robert E. Howard. Conan falls into debauchery, drunken debauchery. He's just kind of like sort of lost and is kind of going through his midlife crisis. He kills some bad guys in this story. That's a pretty short story. Then we move to Devil in Iron. It's another story by Robert E. Howard. He's wandering again. He's lost his gold. This story is actually the third story, Devil in Iron, is partly told from the perspective of the antagonist named Jehunger. I think it's Jehunger. Jehunger, Jehunger, and I think that I remembered that correctly. I'm not sure. Jehunger's perspective, which is unique. Most of the story is told from an omnipresent point of view, focused on Conan, but this one actually we get some point of views of the guys that are tracking Conan and hunting him and jealous of him and trying to assassinate him. It's kind of a cool story. Then we get the Flame Knife, which is the longest story in this book. This is only 200 pages, but 100 pages are devoted to the Flame Knife, which is story number 4, a Robert E. Howard penned story. And this is where I think the Conan and Robert E. Howard's prose really shines through. I like the way Robert E. Howard writes. He writes, and I don't hate, because this is going to be a very accurate comparison. Zane Grey was writing Westerns at about the same time Robert E. Howard was writing these Conan stories. And I'm telling you, their prose is comparable. A lot of the word choices they use, a lot of the way their characters talk to each other, is very similar to Zane Grey. I always compared David Gemmell and his fantasy novels to like Louis L'Amour, because they were writing theirs kind of, and Louis L'Amour was David Gemmell's kind of favorite fantasy author, or a Western, or favorite writer in general. Like David Gemmell, the fantasy author, his favorite writer was Louis L'Amour. And he's mentioned that several times in interviews. And it's easy to spot the similarities in their prose and their style. And I say that Robert E. Howard and Zane Grey share similar traits as writers. That's an aside. Let's get to the Flame Knife. 100 pages long, longest story in here. Set in the desert landscapes, and one of the reasons I took this book with me down to Moab, Utah, is because I remember the first time I ever read Conan books, I was on a trip to Capitol Reef, Utah as a youngster, and so I always kind of equate the Conan books with the desert, and a lot of them are set in the desert. And even if you watch the Conan movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, a lot of desert landscape scenery. And so I read a good portion of this book while down in the southern Utah deserts. And it really and as I was reading this last story in the book, the desert landscape, the supernatural sort of feeling just the desert gives you. And not only that, but Conan is fighting some undead, some ghouls and supernatural foes, and he's got some fierce warrior women by his side in this one. It's just a really cool story. All of these books are set in the desert, but Robert E. Howard's prose really shines through in describing the desert landscapes in the final story, and that's why I love this book quite a bit. And I'm going to give this one a solid 9 out of 10. It's just a great entry into this series of 10 books that I am going to eventually read and review all of them.